We now move on to our first panel of the day on insults, scandals, and attacks, exploring the dark side of political communication. I've come up with these titles, so please feel free to insult me if they are too ludicrous. But I am very pleased to introduce Kate Dommett from the University of Sheffield, who has presented at the conference already and will be chairing this panel. Kate, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Christian, and thank you so much for that previous panel. It was absolutely fascinating. So yes, I'm going to be chairing the next session, which, as Christian mentioned, is Insults, Scandals and Attacks, Exploring the Dark Side of Political Communication. So we've got 3 absolutely fascinating looking papers. I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar with the format by now, but just in case this is the first, you're turning up for the first time on the last day, each paper has 25 minutes, going to have presentations for around 15 minutes, then allowing 10 minutes discussion for each. So make your comments and make your questions in the comments, and then I'll be asking those to the presenters. And also, just for the presenters themselves, I'll send you a private message after 12 minutes has elapsed, and then 15 minutes, just so you know what is going on. But let's get to the main event and kick off. So first of all, I'd like to hand over to Mohammed Abubakari, who's going to talk to us about politics of insults, threats to constitutional democracy in Ghana.
Greetings to everybody, academic colleagues, conference attendees, everybody here. I'm much more humble to be part of this scholarly gathering, and I think it will be productive to all of us here. My topic, as has been announced, is politics of insult, a threat to constitutional democracy in Ghana. Introduction. Ghana has a checkered history of constitutional rule, marked by the period of military disruption. However, the country has since 1992 enjoyed uninterrupted constitutional democracy. Major among the achievements of the current democratic order in Ghana is freedom of expression, which is enshrined in the Constitution and strengthened by the repeal of the criminal libel law. However, over the years, politics of insults has become a feature of Ghana's democratic dispensation. This anomaly, which becomes more pronounced in every election year, is a source of worry to many lovers of democracy. And since we are just about to engage in another election as part of our democratic journey in the Fourth Republic, there is the need for this paper to discuss politics of insult from 3 perspectives. And these are factors, motivation, and consequences. The objective is to highlight the dangers of the disturbing trend for public appreciation and effective solution. And we come to methodology. This is purely a qualitative paper because it applies content analysis and it has sampled vulgar expressions by politicians in the last 2 years. This sample is complemented by data extracted from some respondents. These respondents have been sampled purposively. They are political analysts, voters, and political communicators. We come to the literature review. The related literature review for this study includes theories of mass communication, democratic citizenship, and constructive pragmatics. So we need to look at some of the theories of mass communication. And we come to the libertarian theory. In the 16th century in Europe has become a fundamental feature of liberal democracy in contemporary society. The libertarian theories are against authoritarian viewpoint. And this therefore takes us to the authoritarian theory. The authoritarian theory is another classical theory of mass communication, which recommends that the mass media is influenced and sometimes abused by the powers that be in a country ruled by an autocratic leadership. Characteristically, the media must respect what the authorities want and work according to the whims and caprices of the authority, though not under direct control of the state or the ruling class. Censorship is a glorified norm, and the independence of the media a serious crime in an authoritarian media regime. Another theory very relevant to this study is social responsibility. Social responsibility theory allows free press without any censorship, but it expects the media to accept any obligation from the public interference or professional self-regulation or both. Clearly, this theory is an amalgamation of authoritarianism and libertarianism, as it guarantees media freedom but entertains external control. Here, the media ownership is largely private, and of course, depending on the context and the jurisdiction. I've just enumerated features of social responsibility, and they are formulating the code of conduct for the press, improving the standards of journalism, safeguarding interests of journalism and journalists, criticizing and imposing sanctions for violating the code of conduct. Then we come to communist theory. In line with this theory, the media is taken as a critical part of the state. Ownership of the media is with the state. The country runs the media in accordance with the wishes of the Communist Party or the ruling class. The media is supposed to work for the betterment of the state, communism, and whatever the elite of the Communist Party command. Any move against the growth of communism is a crime that may attract serious consequences. We've also enumerated features of communist theory, but I think we need to go straight to the relevant constitutional provision, because I've mentioned Ghana as now provision driving democratic dispensation in Ghana. And in relation to the media, we have freedom, a particular constitutional provision on freedom and independence of the media, and that is Article 162 of the 1992 Constitution. The Article 162(1) states, and I quote, freedom and independence of the media are hereby guaranteed. We come to the Article 162(2), quote and unquote. Subject to this Constitution and any other law not inconsistent with this Constitution, there shall be no censorship in Ghana. There are other constitutional provisions, but I think the most important ones are those that I have just mentioned. And so we can go straight to democratic citizenship. I think we need to also understand that there is the need for the media, the voting public, and the government to appreciate the weight of democratic citizenship in pursuit of democracy and in practice of the media. And therefore, democratic citizenship here is highlighted as something that goes more, or it goes beyond mere citizenship, because it demands more, it involves much more, and it demands becoming informed about issues that affect you and participating with others in determining how society will resolve those issues. Then democracies are built on the belief that people should be free, should have choices and opportunities, and should work together to make one another's lives better. If we want to maintain our democratic society, we must teach our youth to be good citizens, which go beyond teaching them to obey the laws of the land. We must also teach them about their freedom, how their freedoms began, and how the freedoms are maintained. We must teach them that they can make a difference, and that if they do not become democratic citizens, they risk losing their free way of life. We can still go straight to the theories of pragmatics, because we need to see some of the theories of pragmatics in line with the politics of insult. And then we come straight to discourse analysis. Scholars of pragmatics do agree that discourse analysis is a linguistic theory that examines studying written or spoken language in relation to its social context. It aims to understand how language is used in real life situations. And a work on discourse analysis may focus on the following: the purposes and effects of different forms of language, cultural rules and conventions in communication, how values, beliefs, and assumptions are communicated, how language use relates to its social, political, and historical context. We've been able, we've decided to include the discourse analysis because we want to establish the symbiotic relationship between words spoken and words meant, and how the meaning of those words affects the political environment or the media discourse. Another related theory that is very relevant to this research is the Van Dijk's concept of ideological square. Clearly, this ideological square, the Van Dijk's concept, is nothing but trying to bring about the dichotomy between what is good for us and what is bad for others. The dichotomy between what is positive for us and what is positive for others. So in line with this theory, a journalist may be informed or may be influenced to do write-ups that are positive to his or her political ideology, and write-ups that are negative to the political ideology of another person. That is simply what Van Dijk's theory stands for. And therefore, there is the need for us to look at the highlights of the discussion. And we are saying that as we are discussing verbal vulgarism in the global political space, including that of Ghana, the Media Foundation for West Africa has launched its 2020 monitoring of language use on radio. And so far, the Ghana-based Media Advocacy and Accountability Organization has cited a total of 156 indecent expressions. Expectedly, culprits of these irresponsible expressions are radio show hosts, influential political party officials, and party loyalists. Definitely, we may agree that the word insult is an abstract noun of relative connotation. It means differently to different people in different contexts. And therefore, this foundation has been able to define what it means by indecent expression. And according to the definition, the indecent expression is any statement or insinuation that seeks to attack or damage the reputation of an individual, political party, or ethnic group, or that could provoke the target of the expression to react in an unpleasant or offensive manner, or that could offend the sensibilities of members of the public. These include insults, prejudices, or bigotry, inflammatory expression, hate speech, travel slang, and stereotyping, provocative remarks, unsubstantiated allegations, and gender-related insults. So we come to findings. After data analysis, the paper makes a number of findings. Key among these findings is that mastery of political insult attracts ministerial and other appointments in Ghana. This way, politics of insults breeds cronyism and patronage rather than patriotism and service. And it is a reality in Ghana that most of the politicians who have been given the juicy appointment have also been named as those who have mastered the art of insult. And therefore, political parties have now decided to look at they have decided to do away with their competence and glorify insult as a source of political reward. And then our conclusion is that the politics of insults constitutes a threat to national unity, political stability, and governance competency. And we all know we all know that these are all requisites for democracy. And therefore, we come to the recommendation. Our recommendations are clear. In the light of the conclusion, the following recommendations could be considered. One, we are suggesting that democratic citizenship education should be upheld by every political party, by the government, by the national culture on civic education, by everybody interested in democratic consolidation in this country. And I think the Ghana Journalists Association has a role to play in this, this patriotic duty. I think it should be regarded as a civic responsibility that should be accepted by everybody. But most of the acts of insult arise from the ignorance of the dynamics of democratic politics itself. Another recommendation that we think will be appropriate here is the media accountability. Definitely, political parties and politicians may have their own interests, but media people are professionals who are expected to be governed by, they are expected to be governed by ethics. So they should be a kind of media responsibility. Then we have reprimanding instead of rewarding agents of politics of insult as a mechanism to sanitize democratic politics and to safeguard constitutional order in Ghana. Thank you very much for listening. I'm so much grateful. And I'm here for your comments, opinions, agreements, and disagreements to enhance the quality of this discourse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. That was really fascinating. Great to hear about a different case. So I'd encourage everyone to add their questions to the comments, but Christian has jumped in like the good organizer he is. So he's asked, did your research distinguish between insults pronounced by politicians and media coverage of them? And are the media more likely to cover politicians if they resort to insults?
Sure. Most media organizations in this country have political lineages. And the argument has always been that insult is relative. So particularly in this regard, because we have not been able to have a contextual definition of insult in relation to democratic politics in this country, media people have the leverage to use any other word. But I believe that from the individual point of view, any account that is not palatable to you should be seen as something that should not be palatable to any other person. And if we are able to accept this criterion, then we should know what constitutes insult and what does not, in line with the political communication.
That's great, thanks. So the questions are coming in now, which is always good. So from Dr. Camioriolo said, what is the place of the social media in propagating insults? So were you just looking at radio, or did you also look at social media?
Well, the study covers all forms of media, but I've just used the radio as a sample. Definitely, we have a problem. The problem is that you agree with me that this is an interdisciplinary study, and it is something that is related to law, to journalism, to communication, to politics. And therefore, definitely, because we do not have adequate laws on the use of social media, the social media becomes the fertile ground for attacking the personalities of people. Definitely, to be frank with you, in Ghana, we generally have a problem with the social media. But the only solution, and that is not covered by law, is that most people are not interested in the content of the social media. They regard the social media as a platform where anything goes. And therefore, it is not even a serious platform. For example, if you are attacked on Facebook, you hardly would even want to respond, because they see the Facebook or any other social media platform as highly informal, where anything can be said, where serious people cannot at all be influenced. and where people do not even want to associate themselves with. So definitely, yes, we have problems with the social media, but that is clearly in line with the inadequacy of the law in relation to the social media.
Questions coming thick and fast, but I think one point that was particularly interesting about your presentation was the recommendations. So Paul D'Angelo's asked, how will media accountability be implemented? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I belong to the Ghana Journalists Association. Even though I am an academic, I belong to the Ghana Journalists Association. And this association should be able to lead the crusade for media accountability. Of course, we belong to an association that should be governed by ethics, and the code of conduct should be enforced by the media. Again, here, let me comment the Ghanaian constitution, because there is a complete chapter on regulation of the media. And here, contextually, the word regulation has nothing to do with censorship. Regulation is just to ensure that media practice is within the confines of rationality and civility. And then, so if we are able to get the Media Commission, this is a regulatory body. Ghana Journalists Association is also a regulatory body for the media practitioners. Then we have the National NCA, National Commission on National Commission on Education, Civic Responsibility. These are all institutions that should come together, first of all, to emphasize the need for media accountability and to roll out programs that will ensure proper media accountability. Let the politicians even understand the need for media accountability. Let the politicians understand that if they decide to deal with journalists who do not respect media accountability, then they lose the chance of winning the election. And if we are able to do this, definitely we can have a lot of success in relation to media accountability.
That's great. We're really running out of time on this question, but there's been some absolutely amazing questions in the comment. And I'd really encourage you to kind of go and answer them, because I don't think we've got time to do that now. But I just really like to thank you, Mohammed, for that presentation. It was a really great way to kick off this panel. Lots of rich detail there. So moving swiftly on, we are now going to our second paper, Holding the Fallible to Account, a comparison of media scandal coverage in the US and UK. So this is a jointly authored paper between Erik Bucy and Paul D'Angelo, and we are lucky enough to have Paul here to present to us. So without further ado, I will hand over to Paul.
Thanks again, Kate. Thanks for inviting Erik and me to this wonderful conference. Here are our slides. There's a lot of information here in this presentation, so I'd like to give you the upshot up front. First, this paper is part of a larger project, which is no surprise. I think many of them are. It is a content analysis of mainstream print news in the immediate aftermath of 8 recent media scandals, 4 in the UK and 4 in the USA. In the larger project, what we mean by immediate aftermath refers to 2 things: a press crisis for news media and a priming window for news audiences. So there's a fair amount of conceptualization that's going on here. The goal in this paper is to describe the topics and the frames in the meta coverage of the press crisis in the priming window of each of these scandals. We begin with theoretical background on scandals. Looking to literature on media waves and critical incidents, we see scandals as focusing events for both the news media and news audiences. A scandal is a focusing event for news media in 2 ways. As you see on the slide, on an organizational level, scandal is actually a series of disruptive occurrences that occurs within and among newsrooms over time along these time-honored dimensions that you find in the literature: ethical lapses and professional transgressions, unlawful activities performed in the course of reporting, and also systemic inequities and patterns of abuse tolerated within specific newsrooms and news organizations and even across wider news industries. Sooner or later, these occurrences come to a head at a particular time in coverage of a particular occurrence, as you can see here in this photo of the News of the World phone hacking scandal, which broke in 2011. And that's a photograph of the New York Times Magazine that broke it. Second, when a scandal comes to a head in public discourse, in intensive coverage and breaking news, it engenders a press crisis. This is another way that conceptually a scandal is a focusing event. A press crisis takes shape in several ways discursively. It takes place in the topical dimensions here of scandal occurrences. I'm not sure I got it. There we go. And it also takes place in the meta coverage of accountability framing that aims to hold fallible individuals and organizations to account. There are many recent examples. We look at several of them in this project, as I mentioned, 4 in the US and 4 in the UK. You can see on the side there the Brian Williams resume stretching and firing scandal, which came to a head in 2014, but of course had many precursor events. And the same with various scandals down here in this photograph at the BBC, including the pay gap story and the Jimmy Savile sex abuse scandal, both of which became price crises and both of which are included in our content analysis. To give you a full sense of the project, scandal occurrences are also a focusing event for news audiences, particularly after those occurrences have become a press crisis. This occurs on a social and cognitive level, whereby the press crisis concentrates people's attentions, evokes their emotions, it shifts public attention onto the media's own scrutiny of the press scandal, and in our project, it instigates a process that we call press priming, which has 2 sub-processes. One, per priming's main mechanism, it activates standing attitudes about the news media's role in society, notably about freedom of the press and media social responsibility. And from there, it prompts press-related considerations about credibility, trust, and regulations. So with that background, here are the project's goals: to observe the discursive formation of different press crises across 2 monitorial news cultures, UK and US, in the meta coverage of specific topics and accountability framing. And second, which we've already begun and published on, as you can see there on the screen, to test an integrative press priming model of news evaluation based on individuals' knowledge about the press crisis that they gleaned from exposure to both kinds of meta coverage. So in a way, we're looking back now at what is actually in the priming window and the results that we found in our first study. You can see here quickly that it's a multi-methodological approach that the full project takes, and in which this particular paper is embedded. Surveys, interviews with journalists, focus groups, and the bottom one there, the content analysis that we're reporting on today of meta coverage of scandal-related topics and accountability framing. Here's a graphical illustration of a press crisis. From precursor event all the way through to the press priming process, whereby attitudes are primed and credibility judgments and regulatory evaluations are activated. This study is about the lighter blue windows in the middle here, these 2. That is to say, its goal is to determine when the focusing moment happened, both inductively and deductively, to set up the search terms to capture meta coverage in the priming window here, to determine how long the priming window is, and to content analyze all the meta coverage in that priming window. Here are our research questions. First, how salient is the overall scandal topic in the sampled stories for each press crisis? We found it necessary to evaluate the quality of our search strings to retrieve stories about the scandals. Second, what specific topics are most frequent in print coverage for each press crisis? This, of course, is a analysis of the specific topic profiles for each press crisis. That is to say, for each scandal. And third, what is the frequency of accountability scripts in meta coverage for each press crisis? And does the frequency of accountability scripts differ according to country of scandal? This, of course, is the framing profiles looked at in comparative perspective. Here's some information on the content analysis methodology, including here the 8 scandals, reading from left down. Our sampling procedure, which aimed for 100 stories in the priming window for each press crisis. You can see that information right there. The news sources we use, which are the highest circulation papers in both countries. And some information on this side of the slide about the coding process, which included determining the all-important search strings per research question 1, which included determining and coding the salience of specific topics for each press crisis. That's research question 2. And also theorizing and operationalizing the accountability devices or scripts coded across all of the meta coverage of each press crisis. Okay, so specific topics for each crisis and common accountability framing coded across all of the scandals. That's research question 3. Moving into research question 1, here are the search strings for the US cases we used to retrieve stories about the US press crises, along with, as you can see in the smaller type here, the priming windows that we determined for our study. For the Brian Williams resume stretching scandal, for the Matt Lauer sexual misconduct and harassment scandal, for the Bill O'Reilly sexual harassment scandal at Fox, and for the National Enquirer catch and kill policy scandal. As I mentioned before, determining when the focusing event occurred and how long the priming window should be depended on both inductive and deductive reasoning, including, as you see here, the use of analytics to see when a scandal spiked in coverage and for how long. So Erik and I did this kind of analysis to help us determine when the focusing event occurred for each of the scandals and how long we should code. And if you look back at the previous slide, it's typically between 1 and 2 months that we determined was suitable for the priming window, for the coding of the priming window. Okay, research question 1, some results. This slide shows that we fairly successfully sampled stories about each of the US press crises in the priming window, whereby, with the exception perhaps of the Brian Williams case, 70% of the stories, this is percentage of stories on the left, whereby 70% of the stories had at least one or more search term in the headline or lead, which in the small print below you can see is what we call primary salience. Again, we were looking for stories about the press crisis or to determine how well our search terms captured those stories. Likewise, this slide shows that we fairly successfully sampled stories about each of the UK press crises. Again, with some sort of dipping below, what we informally come up with is 70% of the search terms, one or more of the search terms showing up as primary, in a primary position, having primary salience. Going on to research question 2. This chart shows the salience of the top 4 specific topics listed under here, pithily I know, the top 4 specific topics for each press crisis. Note the gray bars, okay, which show how prevalent the topic is, which is to say more than one mention in the percentage of stories. So each story, of course, has a specific topic profile given its specific characteristics. I no time to go into each topic right now, but remember, this is the meta coverage that primes individual attitudes and evaluations. I'll come back to this Matt Lauer case in a second. This slide shows the prevalence of specific topics in each of the UK press crises. Note that for some of the press crises, we only managed to code a few topics. The BBC Pay Group, for example, and if you go back to the Matt Lauer, the sort of low incidence of those topics, which means that either that there weren't very many topics objectively in these stories, or that our coding instrument needed more iterations, and so we are looking at that. Moving on to research question 3, this slide shows how we theorized and derived the accountability framing devices or scripts. This goes back to some work I did with Frank Esser on meta coverage, and the strategy here is to conceptualize framing devices as propositions, okay, right here in this block, as propositions that articulate a broader frame. In other words, to see context in small places. This project, like what I did with Frank, this project drew from Entman's framing functions to identify different sorts of framing devices that together compose the accountability framing we're interested in coding. This chart here gives you a view of those framing devices in the now familiar categories that Entman devised in his framing functions: causal scripts, remedy scripts, and moral evaluation scripts. We can say more about that later if you want to know what they are in more detail. So results for research question 3 on these 2 slides, the US cases and the UK cases, show a pattern across both countries. Namely, accountability framing seems to spice up the meta coverage within these priming windows. The frames we found had a tertiary salience, and you can see here, tertiary script salience. No scripts of the headliner lead, at least one accountability scripts in more than 25% of the remaining paragraphs. I'm sorry, less than 25% of the remaining paragraphs. So it's there. It mixes in with the topics, but in terms of its salience in the story, it doesn't show up in the lead parts of the story, which some framing research over time seems to indicate frames should show up. Nonetheless, there it is, and there's a pattern across both countries. I'm going to skip this one and go right to the discussion. Brief discussion. So what does this mean? A media scandal coalesces into a press crisis through the breaking news of a specific event or incident in the scandal. A press crisis is a discursive construction with a specific topic profile. Moreover, a press crisis is a discursive construction with an accountability framing profile. And what we found across these 2 monitorial news cultures, again, borrowing from the literature on discursive institutionalism, we found a common framing profile in the US and UK meta coverage, regardless of the unique topic profile and type of scandal. In our larger project, these topics and these scripts constitute a priming window of news evaluation on the part of news audiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was absolutely great. So there's no questions that have popped in, so I'd encourage anyone who has got a question. That was such a rich, I feel like there was an awful lot of data presented there. It was really fascinating. Okay, so the questions are rolling in. So first from Fred Mandai, we've got, why just press crisis in this digital era?
Sorry?
So why just the press crisis in this digital era?
It seems to me that a press crisis is overarching to news industries, news organizations, whether they're digital native or whether they're legacy. It's an overarching theoretical construct that we see as a discursive construction. There's a lot of, I think, possibility for analysis of how the press crisis becomes, say, the focusing event occurs. And there, I wager that a fair amount of the reason the focusing event occurs is through the efforts of digital native sites that break stories like BuzzFeed and others. So I don't really see, and if Erik is here, I don't know if he'll chime in, but I don't really, see the idea of a digital era as somehow changing, you might say, the theoretical formulation of what a press crisis is.
Yeah, I guess I would add a little bit to that.
There you are.
There's a lot of different things you could study, right? And not just the scandals we looked at, there's various other scandals. There's even kind of the larger problem of, does the press responsibly cover major events like the economic downturns or the COVID crisis or even the Trump presidency? And then there's the question of, well, what do you study? Do you study elite print media? Do you study broadcast? Do you study the digital space? And the reason we stuck with kind of a traditional model is that if you look at a lot of the content that's shared or the discussions that happen around scandal, they wouldn't be top of mind. They wouldn't even be on the agenda. For instance, going all the way back to the News of the World scandal, if the New York Times hadn't dedicated, serious resources to investigating that and documented it in a way that's almost irrefutable, and then it's on people's minds. So we wanted to go to kind of the, not just the agenda setting media, but really the accountability holding media. And they have the clout, they have the resources, they have the prestige to hold others to account. And you see this across both highbrow and lowbrow. In the UK, we looked at tabloid coverage as well. And it's just a really interesting dynamic to see this play out. It's essentially media self-regulation.
So we have another comment coming in, which I think might be interesting to hear your thoughts of. And is there a kind of another leg of the discourse around press crisis, which is the resultant consequences of coverage on the audience? Would you agree with that perspective?
Absolutely, because again, the full project is looking at this paper is looking at what's in the priming window, okay, and the whole idea of doing that and why the results, may be more on the descriptive side, you might say. Why the results, is that we want to see what it is for each of these scandals, most of which we've gathered survey data on. What is priming people vis-a-vis topics and accountability framing? So yes, those consequences of coverage are real, and we have found them in our priming models.
Right, and just to elaborate that a little bit, so in our first paper back in 2014, we documented the effect and we laid out a model of effects, but without the certainty that and the percentage of accountability in the coverage that people were exposed to. And we tracked people's awareness of scandal, not just by asking them, how much have you been paying attention, by asking knowledge questions. So people that could answer more factual questions about these crises were categorized as paying more attention versus others that were lower in attention. There's really a lot to it, but there's other questions. So I'd refer you back to the first paper to see kind of what our model of effects is.
And a question from Fred Madai around, now you've mentioned agenda setting, which kind of theoretical perspective are you using? Are you using agenda setting theory or framing theory?
That's a good question, but anybody who knows my work knows that I'm kind of a pluralist. I think framing is a wonderfully integrative approach. So in this paper in particular, we drew on literature from media waves and critical incidents, as I mentioned, to talk about focusing events. We drew on some work that I did with Frank Esser about how, to sort of flip the script, you might say, on frames, which everyone sort of wants to sort of see as thematic discourse structures, to see them rather as propositional level discourse structures that can permeate text. If there's enough of them, then you can say there's thematic. So, and I also hesitate to say framing theory, because it seems to me that framing theory always latches on to other theoretical perspectives. So I'm not quite sure, how to answer that question, except in the way I just did.
I guess I would chime in saying our model is actually one of priming.
Yeah.
That this coverage primes the audience to think of offending organizations, and then just to tease the paper a little bit, what we say is it activates attitudes towards the press, standing attitudes that might be latent. And the two major ones are media social responsibility and then press freedom. And it turns out it works pretty well.
And just one more little add-on to what Erik said, is that there is some argument in the body of framing literature about whether priming and framing are distinct mechanisms, and I agree with a lot of scholars, including Jamie Druckman and others, that priming and framing work together. In some ways, are indistinguishable in an analysis. So yeah, I think Erik hit it on the head. That it's a priming study that in which frames prime.
So we have a question from Sophie, who's going to be chairing the next panel. How self-aware would you say journalists are of the consequences of this type of meta coverage? Does this coverage also change how journalists view their jobs and roles in democracies?
That's a great question. Thanks, Sophie. We have started interviewing journalists. Maybe Erik, you could say a little more about that.
Yeah, I think they're very aware of it, although, not on a theoretical level, but they definitely see it as their job to call out offenders and to kind of draw the lines of responsible coverage. And it's just amazing. This is where comparative work is really eye-opening, particularly from an American perspective, where you think this is the universe. It's not the universe. And there are some real abuses in the UK with the tabloids in particular. And hacking wasn't just a media scandal with ethical dimensions. It was a criminal scandal with legal dimensions. And it led to an entire government inquiry, the Leveson Commission. And the first part of it was just on practices and ethics of the press. And the second part never got implemented, mostly because the conservative government just doesn't see it as an issue. Be interesting to see if Labor ever takes over, if that gets reopened.
That's great. I'm afraid we've run out of time and I want to move on to our next presentation, but there was a question from Frank that you might want to have a look at, which was also fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was great. So last but not least, we have a presentation from Ayala Panievsky on self-defense or self-censorship, how journalists respond to populist attacks on the media. So over to you.
Yes, so hi everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for distracting me from the second lockdown that was just declared here in Israel. My name is Ayala. I'm a PhD candidate at the Sociology Department in the University of Cambridge. And what I'll present to you today is a section of my PhD project, which explores how mainstream journalists respond or fail to respond to populist attacks on the media and why. In many regions around the world, the current wave of populist politicians, parties, and movements is characterized by extensive rhetoric attacks on journalists, news outlets, and the media as a whole. I'll refer to this phenomenon here as anti-media populism. It is not a perfect term, we can discuss this later. But so that we are on the same page here, populism is defined here following Kasmude and Jan Werner Müller as an anti-elitist and anti-pluralist ideology which divides society into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, or the real people and the enemies of the people. And anti-media populism uses this schemata of the elite versus the people to frame the news media as the enemy, turning journalists into what Jay Rosen calls objects of hate. And from Trump through Bolsonaro to Netanyahu, anti-media populists conduct a public crusade against critically minded journalists and newsrooms, portraying them as biased against the populists and detached from the people, betraying their professional mission to deliver credible news, not as the result of sheer incompetence, but rather due to ill intentions and ulterior motives, sometimes even conspiracy. And of course, this is nothing new that politicians or populist politicians complain about the media. However, the scale and the intensity of this phenomenon appears to be exceptional nowadays, both in terms of the dominance of the anti-media rhetoric within the political agenda of individual populists, and in terms of the global resonance of these claims with populists around the world imitating and inspiring one another. Why does it matter? First, there are certain indications by now that populist anti-media rhetoric has an impact over public perceptions of the news media, particularly when coming from the elites. Second, as international organizations, media critics and journalists have already warned, populist rhetoric might incite actual violence and harassment against journalists. Third, the populist attempt to delegitimize the media is part of a broader attack on the foundational institutions of liberal democracy. And finally, as I will suggest today, even before anti-media rhetoric affects or doesn't affect the public's views on the media, it does affect the way that journalists are performing their work, encouraging them to adapt certain defensive strategies, which eventually shape the news that we consume. So how do journalists cope with anti-media populism? Unlike other targets of populist attacks, journalists are required to mediate the anti-media allegations against themselves, their colleagues, their profession, to the public. And this puts them in a rather awkward position as they are often trained not to become part of the story. So how do they cover attacks on the press? How do they cope with the allegations against them? And what may be the implications? So I examined these questions through the Israeli case. I think that yes, through the encounter between Israeli journalists and Israel's prime minister for the past decade, Benjamin Netanyahu. I think that Israel presents a compelling test case here, primarily because Netanyahu, who is an acknowledged populist, has preceded many of his global counterparts, like Trump and others, in campaigning against journalists and the media. And therefore, studying the effect of his anti-media rhetoric on journalists' work and lives might therefore offer an insight into potential futures of journalism elsewhere. Now, there are many structural factors and conditions that are relevant to journalists' reaction to the public confrontation with populists. I focus today on objectivity as a professional norm, for two reasons. First, it lays at the core of the populist argument against the media, which is not surprising considering that objectivity has been used for decades to legitimize the authority of journalism. And second, it shapes journalists' response to these accusations, because as research indicates, despite the endless criticism over the years, journalists and audiences in various countries, including Israel, still consider objective reporting to be a cornerstone of good journalism, and they do assess journalists' performances accordingly. So methodology-wise, I conducted 45 semi-structured interviews with Israeli journalists who work for national leading news outlets, both TV, radio, print, and online, who cover politics or similar bits, and who have been publicly attacked by Prime Minister Netanyahu, either personally or as part of a specific newsroom. So he would sometimes say this specific journalist is a radical lefty who spreads Bolshevik propaganda, and he would sometimes say this TV channel employs fans of terrorists or whatever it is this specific time. You can see here the sample of journalists, different platforms, women, men, etc. And the interviews were analyzed thematically, and I will now share a few observations with you. So first, when covering the populist attacks themselves, journalists developed a double strategy, which included covering the allegations, so spreading them, but also refraining from responding to them directly or presenting counter arguments in defense of themselves or the reporting. So let's begin with the question of covering the media bashing at all. Ignoring populists is difficult, even when they are electorally weak, since their provocations generate ratings and traffic and coincide with traditional news values and financial incentives. There's a lot of writing about it in the literature of media and populism. And populists in power, like Netanyahu, enjoy a double privilege there because they generate drama and conflict as populists, but also benefit from their position as successful politicians, part of the powerful elite. So there are many good reasons to cover Netanyahu's critique of the media, but my interviewees mentioned specific three strategies that he was using that kind of manipulated the news values and norms and forced them to cover his allegations. So they mentioned his use of the right to reply, his use of live speeches that are timed for the evening newscasts, and social media to attack the press. And when Netanyahu used these platforms for media bashing, my interviewees felt obliged to cover it from the fear that ignoring it would be interpreted as bias. For example, one veteran news editor told me that when Netanyahu sends us a vilifying 5-paragraph reply, journalistic guidelines force us to publish it. Otherwise, we've just handed him a great excuse to bash us once again. But if we publish it word for word, we've just given massive exposure to our own defamation in our own newspaper. But in the name of maintaining their impartiality, my interviewees also preferred not to respond to Netanyahu's allegations or refute them. For instance, they said, if I started replying, I'd be entering his battlefield. This is exactly what he wants, to mark me as his opponent. But he's not my opponent, he's my prime minister. And these are things that we are hearing from American journalists as well. Now, we know that news coverage of anti-media rhetoric, particularly when expressed by political elites, has the power to affect the public views of the media. And preliminary evidence suggests that countering the anti-media allegations is necessary for maintaining the public's trust in journalism. So by covering Netanyahu's accusations undisputed, journalists might contribute to the undermining of their own professional image. Something else that came up was that, in fact, the impact of Netanyahu's anti-media rhetoric was broader, with journalists admitting to changing the way they cover him more generally, not only when he attacks the media. So for instance, if there's a story about Netanyahu's wife, I guess its chances of getting published are, well, the holes in the filter are smaller. We wouldn't publish it unless we are certain that any rational viewer would say, wow, this is outrageous. We are more careful there. So this is not at all to say that Israeli journalists avoid criticizing Netanyahu altogether. If there are Israelis here in the Zoom session, they can tell you that's not true. But they do calculate the risks more cautiously. And a few interviewees brought up examples where this special standard strategy regarding Netanyahu has even led to burying stories altogether. For instance, one of Netanyahu's main targets told me, I've made many adjustments to maintain the public's willingness to listen to me. There were stories that I didn't run, and if I hadn't been branded as Netanyahu's enemy, I would have. I figured that if I published them, it might seem petty. Netanyahu's fans would say, see, you're going after him. But perhaps most concerning, my interviewees indicated that Netanyahu's campaign against what he calls the leftist media had encouraged them to lean to the right when they cover Israeli politics in general, for fear of confirming his allegations that they were biased to the left. So for instance, a leading hostess told me, I've been a journalist for 30 years now and always tried to be fair and balanced. I've never even told my family who I vote for. But now, if you're not on the right, you're labeled a lefty. Journalists distance themselves from the left, and honestly, for a while, I did too. I really didn't want this label. And this tendency was translated into many mini strategies that repeated among different interviewees, adjusting lineups, changing terminology, inviting particular guests or avoiding others. And interestingly, this strategy was exercised by journalists who believed that the media was indeed biased to the left, but also by journalists who believed that the Israeli media was not biased at all, and even by journalists who thought that the Israeli media was biased to the right. So they still thought that in order to maintain their professional facade and objective image, etc., they need to lean to the right. For instance, one radio news editor told me, it is always on your mind. We must balance any item that might be perceived as lefty, but radical right content is just fine. Or eventually you get scared because you know that Netanyahu has an army of trolls. I prefer getting criticism from the left, of course. They are considered traitors anyway. And in this last quote, you can see how journalists tied together Netanyahu's attacks on the press with the particular conditions of the Israeli political sphere, which is highly polarized and asymmetric nowadays. I don't think it's the only case, but that's the way it is in Israel. And the fact that leftist, for instance, has become a derogatory term in a way, is in itself challenging for mainstream journalists who use objectivity to sell themselves to their audiences. So being called by Netanyahu leftist propagandists encouraged journalists to distance themselves from the left, but the price of being associated with the Israeli left today has raised the stakes higher. And one last point, I'm not sure, I'll do it quickly, is that the way the journalists discussed their encounter with Netanyahu and their own strategies to counter it exposed how powerless they felt compared to Netanyahu, and by the way, compared to Facebook and social media companies as well. And terms like it's a lose-lose situation for us, or there is nothing we can do, came up repeatedly, and it had an impact over what journalists believed that they could or could not do in face of the populist challenge. And the term, the influence of perceived media influence, concept from media effects research, discusses how politicians and other actors adapt their behavior according to their perception of the media's power, regardless of its actual power. And to paraphrase this, I would say that my interviewees demonstrated the influence of presumed media impotence, which drove them to limit themselves or narrow their leeway according to their disbelief in the media's power. So they did not seek alternative, creative strategies to defend themselves because they saw this battle as a lost cause. I'll wrap up. What does it all mean? So to sum up, in their attempt to adhere to objectivity and balance, Israeli journalists tend to cover populist allegations against the media undisputed, to exercise greater cautiousness when covering the populist himself, and to lean to the right when covering politics in general. We know that covering anti-media rhetoric without debunking it may amplify it, granting it greater legitimacy and validity. And I suggest elsewhere that the overcautiousness when covering Netanyahu turns anti-media populism into a form of soft censorship. And journalists' alignment to the right risks playing into the hands of the media's harshest critiques at present, and further narrow the sphere of legitimate controversy in the future, because it tilts the entire political debate rightwards, right? Theoretical implications could be, so although objective reporting has often been described in the literature as shielding journalists against political pressures or criticism, it seems like objectivity becomes an obstacle for journalists when they are under populist attack. Social polarization and asymmetric politics make it even more difficult for the media to defend itself against populist accusation, and should get more attention as political conditions that challenge professional journalism today. And finally, the influence of presumed media impotence among journalists and beyond may be as significant as that of presumed media influence, and requires further explorations. There are limitations, of course. I'm using interviews because I'm interested in journalists' perceptions and decision making. But in the entire project, in my PhD, I also analyze media content, etc. And it is also, as I think I implied, it is difficult to distinguish the impact of Netanyahu's rhetoric against the media from the long-standing efforts to delegitimize the Israeli left. However, the two processes are not unrelated. And finally, as we all know, things are changing very quickly, and I feel like journalists are still looking for better ways to deal with this issue, even if they haven't found them yet. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What 3 amazing presentations there. Very rich. Okay, to dive right in, we have a question about your methods. So how exactly did you do the thematic analysis, and did you use any software to do that?
Yes, so I was using NVivo, which is not very convenient to do when your interviews are in Hebrew, I must say. It was a challenge, but I started with very, very small, very specific, tiny sentences, even expressions that repeated themselves. It was sometimes just really striking to see how similarly journalists from different, backgrounds and different organizations, how similarly they speak about those issues. And there were really sentences that came up again and again. And it is also interesting because we hear people like Merti Baron we hear journalists in the US saying similar things as well. I think the Israeli news industry has been influenced quite heavily by the American culture of journalism ever since the 70s, 80s. So I started with very small specific expressions for instance, the lose-lose situation, we are in a lose-lose situation, he's in a win-win situation. This came up repeatedly, and really started with these, and then later built bigger themes from it. And there are so many, the interviews were incredibly rich, and I'm still trying to somehow wrap everything together.
That's great. So comments kind of showing similarities elsewhere. But from Lead, a question: how free and independent is the press?
That's a great question. I think so. I have just published an article with a colleague of mine in Democratization that compares Netanyahu's Israel to Modi's India and Erdogan's Turkey in terms of through three lenses, one of which is their approach to the media. So only from this comparison, you can understand that I'm suggesting that we are not in a great direction here in Israel. We used to believe that the press here is relatively free. There is a lot of adversarial journalism here, and corruption scandals that are being broken, a lot of investigative journalism. But things are changing, and I must say that I conducted these interviews, which were, by the way, difficult to do, because these are pretty high-profile journalists that I had to convince that they should trust me. But I did 2 rounds of field work. One was around 2017, and the other around 2019. And there was a striking difference between these 2 rounds of field work. On the first one, almost all of them agreed to speak under their names. On the second round, almost none of them would, which was for me just very surprising and very concerning. People were far more suspicious, yeah, so I think that there is free press in Israel, but it is being, the chilling effect is clear. And of course, I focus here on the rhetoric against the media, because I think it's important, and this is where the populist addresses both the journalists and the public at the same time, and tries to impact both how journalists work and how the audience accepts the news. But especially in Israel, there are many attempts behind the scenes to take control over news outlets, and this has become a major issue nowadays. And many of Netanyahu's corruption scandals, at least 2 of his alleged corruption scandals, are related to the media and to his attempts to basically bribe news outlets into supporting him using legislation and etc. So it is a complicated question.
That's great. Loads of questions coming in, so I think you'll have to answer some of these. Christian, do we need to move on, or do we have time for one last question?
We have time for one last question.
Excellent, that's really good. So I really want to ask one from Anne, because a couple of people have raised similar points. She's saying, what would you say is the level of resignation across the journalists you interview, and is there any hope left? Would you say this could be different in countries where populism is not in power?
Mm-hmm. I think there is a difference between populists in power and populists who are not, clearly. I think we see here, because this is part of the reason that I think that Netanyahu's case is so interesting, because you see what happens when you have populists as a leader for more than 10 years, and how taking over centers of decision-making, etc., really affects the media's standing, and not only self-confidence, but also more practical, concrete means it has to defend itself. So there is a difference. What was the beginning of the question? If it's...
where is it? It's jumped up on my list.
Sorry.
Yeah, how many journalists have resigned? Do you think, has that been an occurrence?
So resigning is not the worst case scenario. You can surrender in many ways, right? So actually there was one journalist that I spoke to who resigned, and it was a great scandal because she was attacked from the right and by the prime minister and by ministers, and she actually left the profession. She told me she talked in terms of trauma. She said she doesn't listen to the news anymore because it triggers her now. So yes, this happens, but this is relatively in the margins, at least now in Israel. But you can see other things that are happening that are perhaps even more problematic, with people just keeping their jobs, but doing it slightly differently.
Thank you so much. All three papers were absolutely fascinating, and the quality of the questions has been great in this panel. So do make sure the presenters go through and pick those up. But to hand back over to Christian, thank you so much.